Hello, and I hope you're doing well. Thank you for completing your first application paper. I'm looking forward to reading over those and providing you with feedback. As a reminder for this class, there are two application papers to complete, and then you'll get to choose one of them at the end of the term to revise and submit as an updated version. So I appreciate you in continuing to work through all of this material. Let's get started today with this week's set of theories and ideas that we'll be covering. So this week we have three new theories to go over, and I just would like to remind you that the application paper number 2 is due on May 25th. It's exactly the same as the first application paper, but I'm instead asking you to pick among the theories that we've gone over in the later weeks of the class. So this week, we'll be talking about the narrative paradigm, media ecology theory, and communication accommodation theory. The first one here is what's known as the narrative paradigm. This is drawing from the rhetorical theories that we've been going over last week, such as dramatism and rhetoric. And it's the idea that we naturally are compelled and drawn to tell stories and using stories to make meaning out of our lives. In other words, the narrative paradigm pushes back against the idea that we're persuaded simply by logic, instead suggesting that narratives and storytelling can oftentimes be a more powerful and meaningful influence on us. This comes from Walter Fisher, who also helped to develop and modernize dramatism, who was a professor at the Annenberg School of Communication. So according to Fisher, paradigm is a significant change or way that we think about the world. And as mentioned, the narrative paradigm moved away from what was known as the rational world paradigm, or the idea that we're simply persuaded by logic and effectively structured arguments. But instead, this idea of mythos and storytelling playing a really big role in our lives, whether it's fictional media and the stories or lessons that come up in said media, or whether it's the true stories, experiences, and accounts that we hear from other people. Under the narrative paradigm, it assumes that we as human beings are naturally drawn to tell stories. We like to share and recall events over our lives. Whether or not a story is considered to be effective or worthwhile is based on what we see as good reasons, where we come to assess and determine the value of stories. These are determined by history, biography, culture, and character that might come from the person telling the story. We also judge stories based on their rationality of consistency and truthfulness. Does the story make sense? Does it connect? Does it ring true for us? And we find ourselves filled with stories, and we oftentimes use storytelling as a way to structure our own understanding of human experience. And therefore, we need to choose among those stories and opportunities available to us. Narration is an important element of storytelling. It's about the way in which we use stories through both coherence and fidelity. Coherence being whether or not a story makes sense internally. For instance, is it structured well? Does it have a beginning, middle, and end? Does it have similarity to other stories or experiences that we've heard in a way that flows naturally? For instance, the hero's journey is a common way of structuring a lot of fictional storytelling that draws from Joseph Campbell. And then lastly, characterological is this idea that we believe the motivations or influences of characters within the story. I recently watched the most recent Doctor Strange movie, and I did not believe that it had characterological coherence and how it framed its characters and actions. Fidelity is a question of the truthfulness and reliability. Can we fact check the story? Does it seem correct? So we make that determination too as we're trying to make sense of all the stories in our lives. This theory has generated some critique. It's a very broad theory, this idea that we use storytelling a lot. One concern is a question of who gets to tell the stories, or what are considered the predominant stories that oftentimes could be a little bit too focused on the elite. And then the other idea that other forms of persuasion or influence might be lost, that there are other ways that storytelling is not necessarily linked to persuasion. As mentioned, if you think about some of the fables and stories that you might have been told growing up, or you might share with others, such as children, we use storytelling as a way of really trying to make certain values or lessons share. For example, the myth of the tortoise and the hare runs really fast, but takes a nap, gets distracted. The turtle says slow and steady wins the race and wins, right? This idea of slow and steady, focusing on consistent rather than bursts of work is a narrative that we oftentimes are told that reinforces our work ethic and way of approaching and addressing issues. That tends to be a lot more persuasive than telling a child, you need to focus on your schoolwork, right? This application here shows us how storytelling can work in action. Secondarily, let's talk a little bit about media ecology theory. Under media ecology theory, it's this idea that media has incredible power and influence over our lives, that technology and the ways that technology has changed have not only impacted how a message is delivered, but also the message itself. We can think, for instance, about the character limits on Twitter as a very material example of how the constraints and impacts of technology have shaped us. And of course, more recent apps such as TikTok are also examples of media ecology theory in action. This comes from Marshall McLuhan, who comes from a communication background and is famous for the quote, "The medium is the message." We can agree or maybe disagree with McLuhan's point here, but this again speaks to the power that media might have in controlling the information that we receive every day. Media infuses nearly every act and action in society, according to MET. It impacts our perceptions and it connects the world. Media has this incredible power. Pictured here on the right is work from a communication scholar, Shelley Turkle, who talks about the role of technology in communication. This idea of being alone together. We're sitting next to each other, but we're on our phones. And so media has this major power and influence in how we understand the world. Ecology is an important component of this theory. We might think about ecology as kind of being focused on the environment, right? And so you might wonder why this is here in communication. But media ecology is the environment or physical and digital setting that's created through the use of media. It's how media and communication influence our perception and understanding of the world, how we feel, understand, and engage with that world, and so on. So it's creating this backdrop through which we relate every day. Additionally, we have moved through what are known as historical epochs, starting with a tribal era or very early in development that was very much focused on interpersonal communication without a sophisticated or developed use of language. A literate era that shifted to using signs and symbols that were written to communicate. The print era with the Industrial Revolution, the invention of the printing press, and the creation of some of the first mass media. And of course, our current era, or the electronic era, and how the usage of electronic technology and information has shaped how we communicate. Additionally, according to this theory, we run on a spectrum in terms of media from hot to cold. Cold media is something like a text or email. It's asynchronous, it doesn't really engage with the senses, whereas the other extreme is hot media, using something such as a video or really interactive communication that engages you more and engages in a more active and synchronous context. Additionally, media has shifted over time. We see a lot of old technology that is obsolete, right? Additionally, media can become enhanced over time, such as new additions or models or software updates that we get at the worst possible times. Media can be retrieved or used or stored, and sometimes media goes backwards. For instance, record players have become incredibly popular, even though there have been changes in electronic communication because of the quality of their sound. This has also been generated some critique. One is this idea that the concepts and ideas are a little bit complicated. There's also this critique about whether or not the medium really is the message, right? That the message itself is important and carries weight, and it might be communicated in different ways. and that we're motivated by factors outside of media too. We might think about apps such as TikTok as an example of media ecology theory. We've seen major generational gaps where a lot of younger people are using this app and shifting away from things like Facebook and Twitter. We've also seen a variety of new forms of communication that have emerged through this app, such as using videos to convey and discuss issues related to mental health, self-disclosure, the challenges working through school, right? A variety of issues are now able to be conveyed using these technological resources. The last theory to talk about for today is known as communication accommodation theory. It's this idea, takes a more cultural approach that suggests that we modify or change how we communicate based on the needs and interests of other people. This comes from Howard Giles, who was really invested and interested in the way that we communicate to one another. So this theory suggests that there are similarities and dissimilarities in how we communicate and converse with other people. It also suggests that the way that we understand the speech and ways that people communicate lead to our judgment or evaluation. If we come from a very different culture and we think, wow, somebody's very loud, they're very open, they're very talkative, that might be more jarring to us than compared to living in that culture. And also this idea that language and behavior in our communication has important information for us about how we participate in groups, how we make judgments, and feel senses of social belonging. Accommodation refers to this idea that we are adjusting or modifying or changing our behavior and communication in response to someone else. We might think back to some of the interpersonal theories talking about our self-concept and self-disclosure based on our participation and involvement in groups. That our accommodation involves diverging, not adjusting our communication, converging, right, or coming together, and then the ways that we change our communication based on what we're perceiving from other people. Accommodating involves making sense of the situation and judging how we are adjusting our language, including the norms and expectations of how we might communicate. When we engage in communication accommodation, we have a few different elements. One is where we converge, right, or adjust our communication to meet the needs of somebody else. Diverging is where we make no effort and really differentiate our communication style. And over accommodation is doing something like bending your knees down if you're talking to somebody in a wheelchair, which for many wheelchair users feels condescending and disrespectful. Over accommodation feels inappropriate and can feel patronizing. For instance, in a sensory way, we're maybe over accommodating how we speak, like speaking very slowly. We're putting somebody else in a dependent situation, right? Or intergroup over accommodation involves the use of stereotypes to lump people together in a group. This theory has generated critique because it doesn't account for how within a conversation things could change. It also assumes that we communicate rationally, that our goal is to get our needs met in that moment, which is not always why we communicate. And also that there are a lot of complex reasons that we communicate, and accommodation could shift wildly over the course of the conversation. As mentioned, the 2018 film Sorry to Bother You is an example of communication accommodation theory. In the film, kind of humorously, the main character works at a call center, and he works with making calls to a lot of white clients. And so his character actually has a voiceover in which a white actor is voicing over his words, and it's called a white voice, right? This idea of code switching or changing your language and manner of speaking in an effort to perhaps sound more relatable or interesting or resonant with a potentially racist white caller who's receiving that message. So it's an example kind of satirizing and making fun of the way that we attribute value to the language and voices that we hear, right? It's critiquing how oftentimes for many people of color, the way that language is perceived and understood is often riddled with stereotypes and assumptions. So it's providing an opportunity to think about how communication accommodation theory is occurring and some of the ways in which we can support more equitable forms of support for people who communicate in a variety of different ways. So to wrap up for this week, we've talked about the narrative paradigm and the ways in which storytelling has this persuasive major influence on us. We talked about media ecology theory and how media can shape our own experience. And then lastly, how we can change our own communication to adjust to the needs of others through communication accommodation theory. Next week, we'll be looking at 3 more theories: relational dialectics, cultivation, and cultural studies. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your week. And I will next week share the following video and go over those additional theories. Have a good one.